Hey guys, Stephanie here with the Aeroponic Tower channel, and let's go do a harvest for dinner, and then we're going to talk about all things hydroponic basil and growing basil on an aeroponic tower garden. I'll also share some of my just simple ways of using a ton of basil in our house. We grow a lot of basil, and I know a lot of people like to store it up to use in the future. When I do that, I'll dry some of that, and someday I hope to have a freeze dryer and be able to store some of it that way. But right now, because I can grow it year round, it's not as necessary for me to have large stores of basil because I can just come out to my towers anytime I need it and harvest it. There is a benefit to dry basil for some recipes, so I do put some away for those recipes that just taste better with dried basil. But for the most part, I'm growing it year round. If I need it, it's here, and I will share my succession planning so that you can see how I always have basil and do that in your own aeroponic tower garden. Okay, so let's go harvest some dinner. The seasons have turned here. It's cooling off. My towers are still in a transition period, but I stay on top of my seed starting. I talk about that a lot on this channel, and because I did that, I have cucumbers. Cucumbers love it when it's a little bit cooler. They don't like the heat, and you can end up with bitter cucumbers. So I have been harvesting just an abundance of cucumbers. I would say in the last month, I have had more cucumbers than I did at the beginning of spring. So if you need a fall crop idea, definitely plant your cucumbers. Just make sure you have time to get those fruiting. These are dwarf varieties, so I'm getting a ton of food really quickly on these because they produce fruit. They're a smaller plant. They're like a pot-sized plant. So they produce food a lot faster, which is also my trick. Cucumbers can take quite a while if you're growing a traditional cucumber, and those you would definitely want to grow in the spring moving into the summer. But this time of year in the fall, plop in your dwarf cucumbers and you're ready to go. So check out this beauty. And I just have so many of these we've been pulling off the towers. There's so many more to get, but this is not what I want for dinner. This will be part of my dinner. I'm going to make a Greek salad for myself, but I am making the children stir fry, and we're going to use up a ton of basil that we harvest. So let's go on a little tour, harvest the things we need, and then we will talk about all things hydroponic basil. Okay guys, I got my harvest. So what I was able to gather was some green beans, eggplant, peppers. A lot of times when your peppers start producing again, they'll be smaller. So a trick to get larger peppers is go ahead and harvest the small ones. I've got some black peppers a red jalapeno for a little kick, and some purple bok choy, and some purple Mizuna mustard. And then I have my huge harvest of basil. So I harvested this last night and got it washed, and we're gonna chop all this up and make a stir fry. Alright guys, and for the dressing, and sorry it's so orange in here, we just live in a dark cabin, it is what it is. I'm going to use some rice wine vinegar, some amino acids, sesame seed oil, and then I have some fermented ginger. This is chopped up ginger, chopped up peeled ginger that's been fermenting in honey. Makes the best sauce. And also some honey fermented garlic. I'll probably cut up about 4 garlic. And then I'll drop some of the ginger into this dressing as well. So let's get this mixed up and we're going to take it outside to the grill. So growing, that's stinging nettle, so I was just trying to make sure I don't get my face too close to it. So growing hydroponic basil on an aeroponic tower garden is super easy. And when you hear me say hydroponic basil but then say aeroponic tower garden, they're really one and the same. And I'm gonna make a whole video on aeroponics versus hydroponic. There's a lot of different options within those two. But really they all fall under a form of hydroponics, which is a soilless growing using water and nutrients. And I like to call these hydroponic when I'm referring to basil because that's a more common word than aeroponic. And technically, aeroponics is using a misting system where the roots are in air and water is misted on them. And on our towers, the water is actually in a reservoir on the bottom with the nutrients. It's pumped to the top and it drips down. So it's kind of a hybrid in my opinion. It kind of lands somewhere in the middle just because of how much water these are getting exposed to and how they're getting exposed to. So just if I say hydroponic and aeroponic, that is why. So whether you're growing on a tower garden or more traditional hydroponic system or using like the Kratky method, all the steps are pretty much the same from my understanding. But for this video, I'll be speaking to, my techniques for growing it on an aeroponic tower garden. So technically, my method should transfer across all hydroponic systems. There are some indoor systems. I've actually been given a few systems to try, and that is a little bit of a different beast. These tower gardens, and that's stinging nettle that just got me, these tower gardens, and I'm going to get the question why I grow this. I grow this for, it's super nutrient dense, full of minerals. Use it for teas and pestos and things. But these tower gardens are definitely more in the larger production hydroponic family than true aeroponic towers that I've seen that are mostly just growing greens and systems that are growing indoors. So some of these new systems, there's like tabletop systems I've been sent some in stands, and you grow in the house with them. Those are just a different beast. So I'm not speaking to growing this type of basil if you're growing on a different system inside of your house. So when growing on an aeroponic tower garden, and I have grown basil inside on one of those smaller systems, it's just a smaller plant. It's not the same. I don't really know how to describe it. We can grow a lot more food on a tower garden than any of the systems that I have been sent and tried. And it's because these run, like I said, more like a hybrid hydroponic system. These are for growing a lot more food than some of these indoor systems that you might have seen. Now, that being said, if you are growing inside, and I do grow inside with these in the winter, some of your things are gonna grow slower under artificial lighting than they are outside. So I got my basil up here. I planted this just about 4 weeks ago. I harvested double what's on this plant already from here. So they're just growing extremely fast. It's cooling off a little bit, but we still have a lot of sun. We're in the 80s and the basil's just really thriving and loving it. If you're growing inside on an aeroponic tower garden, it could be a slower process just under artificial lights and depending on the temperature. So I don't like to give exact numbers as far as when to harvest. Growth will depend just kind of on your growing conditions. So growing basil in an aeroponic tower garden, it's probably one of the easiest things to grow and to grow year round. It is definitely a little bit more finicky in cold weather to get it started and can be a little bit slower to get going. But in the warm weather up here on the top of my tower where it's just getting tons of sun and we're in the 80s and it's just super happy, it's growing super, super fast. So that would be the difference, and just kind of knowing that. And then being mindful of that too, if you're growing when it's hot and it's optimal times, then you may want to be starting seeds a little bit more frequently, because I'm going to go through this pretty fast. Some of it's already trying to bolt. It's only about a month in the tower, and I'm already trying to manage some of the flowering so that it doesn't completely bolt. And so now I know when it started doing that, it's time to start some new seeds. so that I'm not without basil, because we want to grow basil 365 days a year. Basil is something most people buy at the grocery store at least once or twice a month, if not weekly, depending on the kind of food you cook and the things you eat. And you can just save a ton of money by growing your own. We call this a money crop because it grows fast and it's a desirable crop. So if you were wanting to make some money using a tower, basil's one that we call a money crop, or one that you could take to farmers markets and really turn for some sort of income. So growing basil on an aeroponic tower garden is pretty straightforward. You're going to, I'll show you guys how to start seeds in a minute and talk a little bit about the one really important thing when you're starting basil and when to put it into your tower, into your hydroponic system. But once you've got it started, this one has 4 plants in it. This one has 1, 2, 4 or 5 plants in it. They just take off. They do really, really well. And for me, I have found that if I want them to grow really fast and I want to turn over my basil a lot and just eat a lot off of it, that growing it towards the top is optimal when you're growing outdoors. Reason being, it's going to get the most sun. They shoot straight up. You could just see how prolific these are because they're at the top and they're getting lots of sun. Basil doesn't like to be wet. It doesn't do well if it's super crowded and moisture can stay on the leaves. You'll start to get some problems like brown spots and things like this. These are just, basil is like any vegetable. It is prone to some diseases and things. So we want to let it grow fast. Keep it somewhere it's going to get lots of airflow and lots of sun, and manage it as far as removing any flowers as they start to form. So if you're growing basil indoors, you wouldn't want it on the top because it's not going to get enough light up there. That's when you would strategically maybe plant it around the middle or a section where your LED lights are going to be able to reach it really well. I grew it all winter. It does amazing inside. It's just a little bit slower. I keep our garage, I grow in our garage, and I keep our temperatures at about 65, which is a little bit cooler for basil. Basil is a heat-loving plant, so it does grow slower. So I just know I have to plant more and interval plant it so that I always have something to harvest. They shot my stool. Now there's holes and bullets in it, but that's okay. I'm gonna get on a step stool here so we can talk about this basil. So like I mentioned, I like to put it in the top this time of year because it grows super fast. I eat a ton of basil. We make pestos with it. I like to blend it in the blender with some water and then make little dollops that I freeze. And so if I have recipes in the winter where I need some fresh basil for like making tomato sauce or something like that, I can pop those out of the freezer. If I don't feel like coming out to the garage to harvest some, I use it in smoothies. I like to mix it with watermelon. So we eat basil more like a lettuce in this house. And it's super nutritious. It's amazing for your nervous system. If you're someone who really struggles to have a calm nervous system, this is definitely an herb you can add to your diet. So when we're growing it hydroponically and we're growing it on our aeroponic tower garden, we don't have to think of it like most recipes where you're just slicing a little bit and sprinkling it on the top and doing it in small batches because it's so expensive. I think it's like $5 to buy a bunch at our grocery store right now. Because we grow so much, I can use like massive amounts of this per meal. So I just used several handfuls of it to make our stir-fry dinner. I'll use it in soups, recipes, smoothies, all those things. So up here, I've been harvesting off of this one for quite some time. It's pretty thick in the stem. And I am starting to get a little bit of disease on here with the black spots. It's common. It's going to happen with basil as they mature, and it's why we want to be interval planting. So one of the things I see that happens with tower gardens a lot is people will put something on their tower and then they'll come and harvest a leaf for dinner, and then this sits here and it gets older and older and woody and starts to get some disease, and then they're ripping it out as a huge plant. We don't want to do that. We want to be eating and consuming our basil in large amounts. So what I like to do is come in and I see it's flowering. It'll change flavors as it flowers, and we want to cut it I'm just gonna use a kitchen knife. We wanna go down the stem and see where new leaves are growing. Here's a good example right here. I've got some baby leaves and we wanna cut it right there, and that will encourage it to branch out a little bit. Now, sometimes I don't want it to branch out. This one I've been harvesting off of for a while and it's gotten pretty thick. So we might not want to do it that way where you're encouraging it to grow. So another option is to take larger sections and turn this into a really hearty meal and use lots of it. So I don't see any others that are flowering up here. I also sometimes, if I don't want it to get super wide, I'll just pinch off any flowers that I see at the top, and that'll encourage it to keep growing in the direction it's growing, which is upward or vertical. And these are all little babies. It's that time of year. These have been in here. It's that time of year where these want to sprout. So now I have all this basil over here. I have a purple basil. These are not trying to flower yet, so I'm gonna let these, but they are going to fall over, especially now that I touch them, because they're getting so tall and I don't have any support at the top of this cage. And that is the one thing at the top of this tower, and that is the one thing that can cause you problems if you're growing on the top. I touched it and you see it's falling over. So that happened to this one the other day, and it's totally fine because we want to be eating this basil. So all I'm going to do is take off these heavier stems, which will encourage it to bush out. And look at that. This one is so incredible. I don't like to cook with this one because it can get murky in your food, but I love to slice this julienne style and put it on top. I'm gonna put this on top of our stir fry tonight. It's just glowing. And I just took some off the top of that one too, just so we could encourage it to go wide. This is where you want it to go wide. Sometimes when it's down here, we want it to go vertical. Here is more of that same basil plant that fell over, and I don't want that because I have a lot of food under here that needs sun. So I'm gonna go ahead and take off this whole stem. And let this one get bushy on the top. All right, and look at this harvest, guys. This is from me trimming, just trimming. Didn't even harvest the whole thing. 3 plants. So the abundance is there for sure with basil. You'll see me a lot of times pull whole plants out and restart them. I do that with basil too, but not like I do lettuce. I'm gonna let it sit in there and manage it. I don't wanna give time frames because it's gonna depend on, if it's growing inside, it rarely tries to go to flower for me. So I can keep those going pretty much all winter. Outside, it's gonna flower really quickly if it's warm out. Right now, it's just like the weather's starting to cool off a little bit, and that's going to tell your plants, hey, go to seed. It's the end of the season, so they're starting to flower a little bit more right now. So I will eventually take these out, but I'd like to wait until the flowers get away from me, and I'm going to show you guys what that looks like in a minute, because I actually use the flowers for something, and I'm letting that intentionally happen. Or when it just starts to get woody, and what'll happen is you'll harvest off of it so much, this one's kind of getting there now, that it just gets really, really woody and thick in the stem. Like this, and disease will start to show up. Those are my signs that it's time to go ahead and pull this one out and put a new start in. These are my young ones. These have soft stems. These are definitely more mature and at the end of their life and need to be replaced. Let me show you one that's gone to flower, and we'll chat a little bit about what I do with those flowers, and then I'll show you guys how to start your seeds. Look at that. Bell peppers. It is super overgrown. This whole tower needs a reset, but I was letting some things mature a little bit more, letting my calendula continue to flower and finish off because we're almost done with the calendula for the season. So this tower is just ready for a switchover for the fall. But I went ahead and let these go to seed. I have harvested a ton of basil off of this, and now it's super woody. It's got long stems. So when they get mature and they start to flower and you stop harvesting the flowers, they kind of explode and get really gigantic. Like any plant that goes to seed, that's common. You can let a lettuce, which is about this big, go to seed and it'll shoot up a flower. And then as those flowers are allowed to expand, it just gets gigantic and it can be a huge bush. One lettuce plant can turn into a bush. And that's the same thing that's happening here. It's just spread out and it is wanting to make seed. Now I could let this continue to flower and make seeds for us, and I may do that with a few of them because I do need some basil seeds actually. But what I like to do is, because I'm not ready to completely turn this tower over, I'm waiting on a few other things to finish maturing before I turn it over into fall winter crops. I like to let these go to flower, and I use the flowers specifically for teas. I like them. I think they add a sweet, nice. The little white flowers are edible, obviously, and they're just super, I don't know how to describe it. They're just really good in teas. So I harvest these flower buds and dry them out and put them with my anise hyssop teas and things. So I like to use the flowers to make teas. So that is one of the reasons why I'm letting this one go to seed for a while. I might try to collect some seeds because I'm running low on basil seeds, and I will continue every day to come out and collect the little flower pods. I try to get them when they have the white flowers on them because I like the white flowers in my tea. And a lot of people say at this point, if it gets to this stage and it's flowering this much, if it has a few flowers on it or it starts to bud, it's not going to really change the flavor of the leaves that I've ever noticed. But they say they get bitter when they start to really produce. Let's test that. I still eat these like I would all the other ones, so I don't really notice the bitter, but I've never really tried like side by side raw. Let's test it. It had a little bitter bite. And when we call it sweet basil, this is a leaf from another one. But it's never like sweet. It's always still like a green. Most greens are bitter. Unless they're in cool weather. Interesting. I don't notice any more bitter. The fresh one is actually spicier. This one tastes better. So, there you go. This one's definitely more aromatic. So I don't notice the difference. Me personally, if I needed basil leaves and I only had ones like this that were going to flower, I would totally use these, and I will use these. And what I'll typically do with these is juice them or add them to my smoothies and then save the flowers. And then once I'm ready to turn this tower over, anything that I don't want to keep for us to eat, it'll just go to the chickens, and they love it and get super happy. So let's go start some seeds. Whew, a lot of basil taste going on. So let's go start some seeds, and I want to share just a couple of tricks I have found work for the most success when growing basil hydroponically. Main reason being that basil leaves do not like to be wet, and if the basil leaves when they first start off start to get wet, then you can have a really high failure rate when you put them in the tower. So let's go start those. All right, and welcome to my kind of messy table here. I'm actually launching a course, and my free ebook and all of those things on an app will be available very soon, loaded with content, free content for you guys. But I've got some projects going on for that. I like to use these individual grow containers, and I will link these below. And the reason is, if you're starting your seeds, you want to keep a dome over it so that they germinate. And if we're starting a bunch of different things because we're growing year round, I may be starting peppers and eggplants at the same time that I'm starting winter squash, at the same time that I'm starting winter cabbages and broccolis and lettuce. And lettuce is going to sprout and germinate really quickly, where peppers can take a while. So if I put them all in the same tray and some come up and some don't, then I'm left having to move the ones that sprouted somewhere else. So I like to just individually do them in these smaller trays. These are super affordable, and I'll link everything I mentioned below. But in here, got bit by something. In here I have my rock wool. I'm going to do 9 basil plants. May seem like a lot, but this is going to be the basil that feeds us over the winter. As we move into the winter months, it's going to start slowing down the rate that it grows outside, probably, unless it stays warm for a while, and then I'll just eat a lot of basil, and that's fine too, and start again. But I'm planning that these are going to grow slower, and that these will be a medium-sized plant by the time I move my towers into the garage for winter. And at that phase, because this garage stays pretty cool, then they are going to, at that point, just really, really slow down in their growth, unless I heat this garage a little bit more than I normally do, and I'm not sure about that. So I'm gonna go ahead and plan for needing 9 plants this winter. And I do get the question quite often, like how many plants you should start. Some of that you're just going to have to gauge over time. And I'm going to have some tools in my app where you can track a lot of that if you want to just like keep some notes, where you can go, okay, I ran out of this, I never want to be out of this, and I've like noticed we go through it this quickly. Those are very helpful. Just for knowing, like, because I had that happen this year too. I've had gaps in some of the food that's really important for our diet because I didn't really calculate throughout the seasons. Like, I mastered how often I needed to plant those things over the winter, but then it became spring and that changes, and then it changes again in the summer, and it changes again in the fall. So in the app, you'll be able to track a lot of that information, which would be really, really cool for me personally. I'm excited about that. So we'll talk about when to put them in the tower in a minute. So I've soaked my rock wool for 20 minutes, and I'm gonna do some leaf lettuce basil. These make giant leaves. I've grown these indoors before and they do fine. And they can be really wonderful for wraps. So I like to do 4 to 6 basil seeds. I have found basil seeds are not 100% germination rate for me personally. So 4 to 6 ensures that I at least have 2 to 4 that sprout. So let's do 3 of these leaf lettuce basils. And then for my other variety, I'm just going to use the Tower Garden ones that were sent to me so I can use these up. I don't love the seeds they send. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them. I just like other seeds. So we're gonna go ahead and use up all these Tower Garden seeds. I tend to like to pick out different varieties for different flavors and different looks and things. So I've got quite a few of these Tower Garden varieties that came with my towers that need to be used up. So again, 4 to 6. For me, it's just a pinch. I'm not gonna count these out. I can kind of tell. Put the rest back in the package. We want to top these with vermiculite. So when you're growing seeds, there's a few things. Seeds don't like to be too hot, too cold. If they're not germinating, if you're having germination issues, it can be one of about 6 different things. I used to say 5, I've added 1 to that, maybe even 7 now. Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, bad seeds, Or you could also be using chlorinated or treated water, and treated water is definitely going to affect your seed starting. So if you keep trying and you keep having failures, it could be that your water has chlorine in it if you're using city water. So I would recommend using some sort of spring water or bottled water or filtered water in that case. And then the reason we do the vermiculite is because it kind of meets everyone in the middle with that too dark, too light. It'll let some light filter through while also protecting the seeds that don't want sun. It'll give them some shade. So that's sort of the happy medium there. It keeps the seedlings moist because we want the seeds to be super moist so that they will germinate out of their seed pod. So it helps with that. They will stay moist even without vermiculite because of the rock wool. But that's what we're going for. I don't start my seeds in water. Some people choose to do that, and they will cover it with a dark cover. I have done the dark cover before if I'm struggling to get something to germinate. Sometimes I'll just cover it. Basically, I don't have a piece of paper, but you can put a piece of paper here and then put the dome on, and just for a day or two, and sometimes that'll encourage things. You can look up specifics on your actual, what you're trying to germinate, and see what the guidelines are. If it says like spinach needs to be cold stratified, so it likes to be in the cold before it's going to germinate. Some things are a little bit more specific like that, so you can look at the individual plant you're trying to start and give them exactly what they need. But overall, I have found if I follow this method, put the dome on, definitely have the little holes closed, and then I start everything on a heat mat. I have found that to be the most successful, and under a grow light. Now these heat mats, I will link these below, are my favorite because they have a temperature gauge on them. We have cooler evenings here, and so I have found that not using a heat mat, unless it's the dead of the summer, I have a slower germination rate. I need that little bit of heat for my seedlings to germinate. And then this one has some, just really fun information on it. It's got some example germination chart, and it will tell you lettuce germinates in 3 days, basil germinates in 5 to 7 days. So those things are on here. And your ideal temperatures, we want to stay in the 70 to 85 range when we're seed starting. So if you don't have a way to check the heat, you can get a little gauge to see what your plants are, and you just stick it right in the rock wool, and you want to see what your rock wool temperature is, and that will tell you what your temperature's at. That is the best way if you want to get super accurate. Not everybody wants to do that, and that's totally fine. I've done many more seedling starts without doing that than I have with doing that, just because life is busy, and I throw these on the heat mat under the light and let them go and just, pray for the best. But these do have a little gauge, and there's a low and a high. High is typically, unless it's super cold, like under 65 in your space, you probably never want this on high. We want to keep it more like in the middle range. And again, that's going to depend on your temperatures in the space that you're growing. So it may be beneficial if you can feel these and kind of gauge. If they feel hot to the touch, your rock wool, it's definitely too hot, and you're going to cause some damage, and those seeds aren't going to germinate. We want that nice, like warm, a little bit warmer than room temperature. So we want warmth to it, not just room temperature, but we definitely don't want it hot. Okay, so for basil specifically, basil, I mentioned some things like to germinate in the dark. Most things actually like to germinate in the light. So basil needs light to germinate. So when you're doing your vermiculite, just keep that in mind too. Keep it a little bit lighter. I still like to put it on there. You're still gonna get light through this, just like you would if you put it in soil. It's still gonna penetrate through, and it's just gonna protect those seeds and keep them nice and moist. But we do want light, so don't put that piece of paper over like I mentioned for the dark. And we're gonna put this on our heat mat. Basil likes the temperature to be between 75 and 85. So that's the temperature we're going for. On here it says 5 to 7 days to germinate, but really I've seen these germinate as many as like 7 to 14 days. So don't panic if after 7 days it hasn't germinated. You may just need a little bit more time. So I will show you guys where I'm going to stick these in just a moment. But before they go into the tower garden, and this is where the most crucial information is for hydroponics, specifically growing, is you need them to be a certain size. So this one is a lemon basil. It's a little bit different than your traditional Genova basils, or what do we have here? The leaf lettuce basils, the ones that we use more for cooking. Smells so amazing. But I still want to show you here what to look for. When you're growing basil, the leaves, when they get their true leaves, so after it germinates, okay, so after this germinates, it's gonna pop up with these tiny, cutest little basil leaves ever. But they're the germination leaves that first come up. They're like brassicas will make the little heart germination leaves. These will pop up with these little itty bitty tiny basil leaves. That's when you're gonna take off the dome and you're gonna continue to leave it on the heat mat under your grow light at that point. Regardless of if you're gonna grow indoors or out, this is how I do it. I don't have a greenhouse to start seeds in. I would start my seeds outside if I had a greenhouse, but I don't. So these will stay on the heat mat under the light until they start to get their true leaves. So this one has true leaves, and they'll get little stalks, little stems like this with some of their true leaves. But the grocery store kind of basil, like the Genova, I think that's what they're called. I'll put the link, I'll put the name up there. But your more traditional food basils that you're buying at the grocery store, those create a big basil leaf while the stem is really short still. And the problem with that, so this one kind of made a long stem. This is a different type of basil. This is more like a holy basil. But the problem with that is because it has such a short stem and the large basil leaves, those leaves are touching the rock wool. And so if you were to put them in the tower when they're like that, that is where we start to have problems because they get too much water and those leaves will be touching the rock wool that's saturated with water. You can get some diseases and some bacterias, and they can just kind of like wilt away and die. There's also some backsplash that comes on our plants depending on how many plants you're growing and the age of your plants in your towers. So sometimes when the water is dripping onto the rock wool, the more saturated it is, the more that can backsplash into the leaves. So we need a good stem on our basil before we put it into the tower. So I like to say about 2 to 3 inches with traditional basil before you put it into the tower. And you want to make sure that all the true leaves, the basil leaves, are not touching the rock wool. So once it's grown tall enough that the leaves are no longer a threat of getting wet by touching the rock wool, that is when we can go ahead and put it into our tower. We want to make sure it has roots on all 4 sides plus the bottom. That's another thing to look for. And then it's ready to go. At that point, you just let it grow and harvest it the way we mentioned before. So let's go put this under the grow light and let me show you guys what that looks like. All right, here is my simple grow station. I grow on 9 towers. I grow interval. I start seeds every 2 to 3 weeks. And this is all I need. I have 3 of these and that's plenty. So you do not need much space to grow a lot of seedlings year round. You just need a simple setup with heat mat, light, and your domes, and that's it. So I'm going to trade out this heat mat, and I switched to these because I had some problems with my seedlings being perfectly temperature at night and then I wasn't coming out and unplugging these during the day because who has time for that? And they were just overheating my seedlings. So I switched to this one so I can keep the temperature just kind of mild and stable without having to worry about unplugging it. So we're just going to take this one down and put our new one up. These lights, I'll link below. These are Fairy Morse lights. They are my favorite because I also don't have to turn these off. I have found that I can just leave these on full time and it doesn't burn up my seedlings. Some lights with the colors, which is a new thing to me. I do not like the colored lights, but those tend to burn plants. Some lights just get really hot and will burn up plants or dry them out as well. So these lights have been my favorite. All right, so we're in the 50s at night. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this to halfway on medium, and I will just feel tomorrow. I know they won't be too hot on medium, so it may be a matter of warming them up a little bit, and I'm just gonna feel them tomorrow and see what they feel like. I've got my light on. I keep 2 on here because often I'm growing about 6 of these trays per section at one time. Right now I only need 1 on, so my light is on, and that's it. We're just gonna keep them here. Once they germinate, we'll pop the lid off. Once they get their true leaves and are about 3 inches from and the stem's about 3 inches, and all of our leaves are cleared of touching the rock wool, it will be ready to go into the tower. Now, one more thing to note here. After they get their true leaves, you need to start feeding these mineral water. So what I do is take water directly out of my tank, and that is what I water them with. I try to water them from the bottom just to keep the algae off the top because it's light and nutrients that create algae. So I'll water them from the bottom. If you don't have a tower set up and you need to make some nutrient water, you can take a tablespoon of A and a tablespoon of B and mix them in a gallon of water or so approximately, or you can do like 16 ounces and a teaspoon of each. Doesn't need to be perfect. It's just to give them a little boost so that they don't stop growing and stall. There are nutrients in their seed casing, but those are only gonna go so far. So once they have their true leaves, start feeding them. And if you are going to grow outside, once they get their true leaves that are pretty decent in size, that's when I take them outside and put them on the rim of my tower and let them start to get sunlight. So if you're gonna grow them outside, it's best to get them acclimated to that pretty quickly. And that's it. Thanks for joining me, guys, on this talk about hydroponic basil, and I will see you on the next video.